There is a woman buried somewhere beneath the ancient ruins of Babylon, and the inscription on her tomb, according to one of history's most famous writers, read something like this: "Whoever was king of Babylon and found himself short of money could open this tomb and take as much as he wanted. But if he were not in need, he should not open it, or it would go badly for him." That warning sat above a sealed tomb, right over one of the main gates of the city, for decades. And every king who passed beneath it resisted the temptation until one didn't. When the Persian king Darius finally broke the seal and swung the doors open, there was no treasure inside at all. There was only a body and a second inscription that read, "If you had not been insatiable and eager for base gain, you would not have opened the tomb of the dead." She had been dead for generations, and she still managed to humiliate one of the most powerful rulers in the ancient world. Her name was Nitocris, Queen of Babylon, and she might be one of the most fascinating figures you've never heard of. The problem with Nitocris is that almost everything we know about her comes from a single source, the Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era. Herodotus is one of those historical figures who sits in a complicated space, because he was genuinely brilliant and remarkably thorough for his time, but he was also a man who freely mixed reliable eyewitness accounts with stories he'd heard secondhand, legends passed down through oral tradition, and things that were almost certainly embellished somewhere along the way. Later writers called him both the father of history and the father of lies, and the title you give him usually depends on which passage you're reading. When Herodotus describes Nitocris, he places her as a queen of Babylon, ruling either as a wife to a Babylonian king or as a regent acting on behalf of one. He credits her with enormous building projects and describes her as a woman of exceptional intelligence and political cunning. But when modern historians go looking for her in the Babylonian records, the cuneiform tablets, the administrative documents, the king lists, she simply isn't there, not under that name, and not in any obvious form. So the question becomes whether Nitocris was a real person whose memory was absorbed into legend, a composite figure built from the stories of several different women, or someone Herodotus invented or inherited from earlier storytellers. Let's talk about what Herodotus actually says she did. Because even if you strip away the mythology and take only the practical stuff, the picture that emerges is remarkable. According to Herodotus, Nitocris recognized that Babylon was becoming dangerously vulnerable to invasion, particularly from the Medes, a powerful civilization to the north and east. She looked at the Euphrates River, which ran straight through the heart of the city, and she saw both an opportunity and a threat. The river was the city's lifeblood, but it was also a potential highway for any enemy who managed to get onto it. Her solution was an engineering project on a scale that would have been extraordinary for the ancient world. She rerouted the Euphrates, not entirely, but enough. She had workers dig a massive artificial lake to one side of the river's course, pulling the water off its original path, letting it pool and spread, and then redirecting it back into the channel lower down. The project took years and an enormous amount of labor, but when it was done, the river no longer ran straight. It curved and looped through the landscape, slowing down boats trying to approach from the north, making the waterway far more difficult to navigate quickly. Anyone trying to reach Babylon by river now had to travel a much longer distance, giving the city more time to prepare a defense. And while she had the river temporarily diverted, she used the dry original channel to build something else, a stone bridge across the riverbed, connecting the two halves of the city that the Euphrates had always divided. For the first time, Babylonians could cross from one bank to the other without using boats. The bridge was built with iron clamps holding the stone together, a construction detail that Herodotus considers worth mentioning, which suggests it was impressive even by the standards of the time. This is not the record of a ceremonial figurehead. This is the record of a ruler who was actively solving strategic problems, managing large-scale public works, and thinking years ahead about the security of her city. But the story that really sticks, the one that made her name worth remembering across centuries and continents, is the tomb. Herodotus says that Nitocris had her tomb built directly above one of Babylon's most trafficked city gates. The inscription was carved into the stone where everyone could read it, visible to every king and official and merchant who passed underneath. She was essentially dangling the promise of treasure over the heads of every ruler who came after her, trusting that the warning would keep them from acting on their greed, and that even if it didn't, she'd have the last word anyway. The psychology of that move is genuinely unsettling when you sit with it. She anticipated that someone would eventually give in. She planned for it. She built her posthumous humiliation of them directly into the architecture of the city. Herodotus names Darius the Great as the king who finally opened the tomb, though some scholars think this detail was added or modified at some point, and that the original story may have involved a different ruler. What nobody seems to dispute is the structure of the story itself: the empty tomb, the second inscription, the ruler left looking foolish and greedy in front of his own court. Whether it happened exactly this way or not, somebody thought it was a completely believable thing for this particular woman to have done. That matters. Now, here's where historians start to genuinely disagree with each other, and it gets complicated in interesting ways. The most obvious objection to the Herodotus account is that Babylonian records from this period are actually pretty extensive. Babylon was a highly literate civilization. They kept administrative documents, economic records, royal correspondence, religious texts. If a queen had rerouted the Euphrates and built a bridge and redesigned a city gate, you'd expect at least some trace of that in the local record. And there isn't one, at least not one anyone has confidently identified and connected to Nitocris. One explanation historians sometimes offer is that Herodotus was simply wrong about her identity. He may have conflated two different figures, or assigned credit for real building projects to a woman whose name he'd heard attached to a colorful story, without fully understanding the context. The Euphrates engineering projects he describes may have been real and may have genuinely happened, but carried out under different rulers whose names didn't make it into the Greek oral tradition. Another possibility that some scholars take seriously is that Nitocris was real, but that she ruled during a period of political instability where record-keeping was disrupted, or that her records were deliberately suppressed by a subsequent ruler who had reason to erase her from official history. This happened more than once in the ancient world, and Babylon in particular went through several violent transitions of power in the period Herodotus is writing about. There's also a third possibility that doesn't get discussed as often, which is that Nitocris existed, held real power, and that her story was simply more interesting to Greek storytellers than to Babylonian record keepers. Herodotus gathered much of his information by traveling and talking to people, including people in Egypt and Mesopotamia, who may have had their own oral traditions about remarkable women from their history. A clever queen who outwitted a Persian king with an empty tomb was exactly the kind of story that would travel, that would get repeated and polished and eventually land in Herodotus's notebooks, regardless of whether the administrative archives back home still had her name in them. If you're enjoying this story and want more deep dives into the people history almost forgot, subscribing takes about 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps the channel keep making these videos. What makes the Nitocris question so persistent is that she isn't the only woman by that name in the ancient record, which adds another layer of confusion that historians have never fully resolved. There's a separate Nitocris who appears in Egyptian records, a queen or princess of the 6th dynasty, roughly 1,000 years earlier than the Babylonian figure. The Egyptian Nitocris has her own set of legends, including some that are similarly dramatic, and for a long time some historians assumed the two were the same person, or that one was a corruption of the other. That view has mostly fallen out of favor now, but it illustrates how easily ancient figures can get tangled together across cultures and centuries, especially women, whose names and stories were often less carefully preserved than those of kings. The Babylonian Nitocris, the one Herodotus describes, is generally placed in the Neo-Babylonian period, somewhere around the 6th century before the Common Era. This puts her in the same general era as Nebuchadnezzar II, the king famous for the Hanging Gardens and the destruction of Jerusalem, though the exact relationship between her and the kings of that period is something scholars argue about. Some have suggested she was the wife of Nabonidus, the last Neo-Babylonian king, or possibly the mother of Belshazzar, who appears in the biblical book of Daniel. Neither identification has been proven, and both come with their own complications. What's interesting about these proposed identifications is that they place Nitocris right at the end of the Babylonian Empire, in the years just before the Persian conquest under Cyrus the Great, in 539 before the Common Era. If she was real, and if she was involved in the engineering projects Herodotus describes, she was doing this work knowing that her civilization was under increasing pressure from the outside. That context, if it's accurate, makes her story even more striking. She was building defensive infrastructure and planning for threats that, in the end, no amount of river rerouting was going to stop. There's something worth pausing on here, which is the question of why her story survived at all. Ancient history is full of kings and generals, and conquerors whose names fill entire libraries. The women are harder to find, not because they weren't there or weren't important, but because the record-keeping systems of most ancient civilizations were focused on the activities that men officially performed: warfare, religious office, formal kingship. Women who held real power often held it informally, as regents, as advisors, as figures working behind or beside the official ruler. And that kind of power tends to leave fewer traces in the written record. Nitocris made it through partly because Herodotus thought she was worth including, and Herodotus was, for all his flaws, genuinely interested in remarkable people, regardless of their gender. He describes several women in his histories with the same level of detail and respect he gives to male rulers, which was not universal among ancient writers. But she also made it through because the stories attached to her name are the kind that stick. The bridge, the diverted river, the empty tomb, they're all stories about intelligence being used as a weapon. Not physical strength, not military force, not supernatural intervention, just a person thinking further ahead than everyone around them and using that advantage deliberately. That's a story that translates across cultures and centuries in a way that a list of building projects doesn't. Whether the real woman, assuming there was one, actually did all of these things or only some of them or none of them, the stories themselves were circulating in some form within a century or two of when she would have lived. That's a relatively short gap for a legend to form around a historical figure. It suggests there was something real underneath it, some memory of a woman who was genuinely impressive that the stories latched onto and amplified. The honest answer to the question of who Nitocris was is that we don't fully know, and we may never know. She sits in that frustrating category of ancient figures who are just barely visible in the historical record, close enough to feel real, far enough away that certainty is impossible. Herodotus describes her as one of the most remarkable rulers Babylon ever had, and given what he says she accomplished, that's a significant claim about a city that produced some extraordinary rulers over its long history. What we can say with confidence is that the engineering projects Herodotus describes, the river rerouting, the bridge, the defensive redesign of the city, were the kinds of projects that actually happened in ancient Mesopotamia. The infrastructure was real, even if the attribution is uncertain. We can say that the Neo-Babylonian period produced at least some women who held meaningful political power, and that the stories Herodotus collected were grounded in a real place and a real period of history. And we can say that the story of the tomb, whatever its origins, was considered plausible by people who knew Babylon, which tells us something about the kind of leader she was believed to have been. She may have been exactly who Herodotus said she was. She may have been a memory of several different women compressed into one figure. She may have been someone whose real deeds were later exaggerated into legend. But the shape of the stories, the intelligence, the long-term thinking, the willingness to plan for her own death as one more strategic move, that profile feels consistent enough across the different accounts that it's hard to dismiss entirely. Somewhere in the ancient foundations of what used to be Babylon, the truth about Nitocris is probably still buried. And knowing what we know about her, she'd probably find it amusing that we're still arguing about it. If you want to keep exploring the women history, Almost Forgot, there are plenty more where she came from, and this channel is where those stories live. Subscribing is the easiest way to make sure you don't miss the next one.